BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Tuesday. Welcome to a brief return for the segment on Black Box Online Radio known as Serial Killer Tuesday. This was something short-lived that I did back in 2023, and in this episode I'm going to be discussing the story of Dennis Nilsen, who was a British serial killer known as the British Butcher, and he also had a lesser-known nickname, the Kind Killer. Firstly, I have to give a big shout-out to longtime Black Box Online Radio follower Batman66, who provided me with the Time Life collection of articles about serial killers, and it's a set of articles that I've worked into different episodes of Black Box Online Radio, and I realized that I had never done an episode on Dennis Nilsen before, so that's where we are today. But next Tuesday there will be a return of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, and that will be part of the channel membership, and that is something where it's just an interactive live stream that I do with you guys where you can discuss any subject under the sun or in the darkness. Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945, and he grew up in a place called Fraserburgh in Scotland. And I'm really quite shocked about how this story is so similar to that of the American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who was known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Monster of Milwaukee. And there's also an even lesser-known American serial killer story that is very similar to this one. That is the case of Herb Baumeister, the I-70 Strangler. So I'm going to be looking at a lot of parallels. Once again, Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945. He grew up in Scotland. He spent 11 years in the army, and he was a homosexual serial killer who targeted males, and he was someone who was dealing with a lot of personal issues that related to masculinity. His father was from Norway, and his mother was British. They met during World War II, and that's when he was born. He was actually the middle child, a problematic middle child, just like me, and his father divorced from his mother when he was 4 years old, and even in the Time Life articles, it states that he did not really have strong memories of his father, and there's also a documentary that has been made about him, an episode of Born to Kill, that talked about the male figure in his life was primarily his grandfather, and when he was growing up, his grandfather just became the person that he bonded with, and he didn't have his father in his life, so he turned to his grandfather, but ultimately his grandfather passed away, and when he actually viewed the body prior to the funeral, this created something in him where there was some type of fascination as well as connection between love and death, or the only masculine figure in his life was now dead, so he developed some type of obsession with morbidity, which would go on to lead him to just compound upon that, to expand upon that, and do some very, very horrific things. And this is actually on page 138 of the Time Life Collective, and it says, 15 young men went to the home of Dennis Nilsen and died at his hands, but there were other visitors to Nilsen's flat who encountered nothing but hospitality. There were even a few guests who, in the space of a single night, saw both the murderous Nilsen and the genial one. Among these were Paul Nobbs and Carl Storiter. Both survived Nilsen's attempts to kill them, and remarkably, neither one of them seemed fully aware at the time how close they had come to death. Nobbs was 19 years old when he ran into Nilsen at the Golden Lion pub. After chatting amiably for a while, the two men went to Nilsen's flat and spent the evening drinking and watching television. When they went to bed, there was some tentative sexual activity, but they both quickly fell asleep between 2 and 3 a.m. Nobbs awoke and with a splitting headache. He drank some water and returned to bed. The next morning, Nobbs looked into the mirror to find his eyes badly bloodshot and his face sore and red. There was an ugly welt on his neck. Nilsen remarked with concern that his companion looked bloody awful, and he should see a doctor. Nobbs took his advice and was told that he had injuries consistent with strangulation. Like Nobbs, 21-year-old Carl Stoddard met Nilsen at a pub and went home with him. At Nilsen's flat, Stoddard went straight to bed. His host crawled in beside him and pulled up a sleeping bag that he used as a blanket. He then warned his guest to be careful of the sleeping bag zipper. If Stoddard thought the comment was odd, he was too tired and too drunk to mention it, and he fell asleep. He was awoke to find the zipper wrapped around his neck, struggling for breath. Stoddard sensed that Nilsen might be trying to kill him, but he was too foggy mentally to offer much of a fight. He phased in and out of consciousness, realizing at one point that he was being held underwater. His next recollections were gentler. They were of Nilsen's dog, Bleep, licking at Stodder's face. Then there was a warming embrace from Nilsen. Despite the gesture of affection, Stodder soon found that he was suffering from the same physical damage as Nobbs. Nilsen explained to his guest that he was having a bad dream, and that Nilsen had thrown water on him to wake him up. Stodder accepted this lame excuse. That's what it says here, a lame excuse, possibly because he found it almost impossible to believe that this gentle host had tried to hurt him. Instead, amiable to the end, Nilsen walked Stodder to the subway and bade him farewell with the wish that they might meet again. How Nilsen could shift from hospitality to homicide so quickly and inexplicably remains an abiding riddle of his complex personality. The killer himself theorized that he was a psychopath who became violent when he drank too much, if he considered alcohol partly to blame for his deeds. However, the British courts apparently did not. They held him fully responsible for the murders he committed. It's possible that no one, including Nilsen himself, would ever fully understand the triggers that caused him to kill. Okay, so there are just so many things that we can respond to in that set of behaviors there. And as I said, this does sound very similar to the case of Herb Baumeister, the I-70 strangler, who would meet men at gay bars. Herb Baumeister was a bisexual serial killer. He was married with children, but he was also a bisexual who would meet guys at gay bars and then lure them back to his home. And it sounds like Dennis Nilsen is doing some things that are very similar. One of the reasons why Dennis Nilsen joined the army, according to Born to Kill, is that he wanted to get away from the small town of Fraserburgh, Scotland, because he just thought that it was an inappropriate place for a homosexual to live in, and that he would never be able to get full acceptance. But also, I want to point out that there are several things here that really seem to be very, very intense. One of them is the fascination between love and morbidity, because, much like Jeffrey Dahmer, it appeared that Dennis Nilsen was really trying to do this because he wanted a connection with the victims. It's not simply that he's ashamed of his homosexuality, or it's not just simply that he has rage towards society or that he hates people. Those could be underlying elements or very small elements, but the conscious thing that seems to be very present with Dennis Nilsen's crimes is that he wanted to stay with the victims for an extended period of time. He wanted to be with them longer, and Jeffrey Dahmer said almost the same things. Jeffrey Dahmer also would do things like keep the body parts around, and Dennis Nilsen would keep the body parts around, and Dennis Nilsen, though, had some very, very extreme fascinations with this, and these are some of the details that they really zone in on here. Like, he would do things like murder somebody, and then place them in a chair, and just watch TV with them, and listen to music with them, and talk to them about how his day was going. And this is something, though, that also carried on into his personal life, because they also said of Dennis Nilsen that he would never be the life of the party. Even if he were interacting with people, he wouldn't try to act like, the center of attention. And my immediate response was, oh, well, he's just kind of calm and reserved and maybe a little bit shy. And no, that was not the next line. The next line was because he was self-centered and self-absorbed, and he would only be able to make conversations in an outward way. And people began to notice this about him, where they would find that he is talking in almost a conversational way, but he's not paying attention to what other people are saying to him, and he's also not paying attention to how other people respond to him. Instead, he is just kind of talking to himself in a way, or he's just monologuing and not paying attention to how other people feel. And this is all completely consistent with psychopathic and sociopathic behavior. And this is a point here, though, that I just read from this page 138 in the Time Life Collective, and that is that how is it possible for somebody to go from being a serial killer and showing their murderous homicidal side to just being nice and calm and gentle? Absolutely, that's psychopathic behavior. Absolutely, that is somebody who knows how to put on this manipulative facade. And I've been talking about this for years on Black Box Online Radio. Even if you go back and listen to my old episodes about serial killers from 2020, you will hear certain descriptions that I'm giving about that, because that's how psychopaths and sociopaths function. They can immediately switch into instinct mode and survival mode, and they will say whatever they have to do to calm the person down, and they will say this in a way that does not show any outward signs of distrust or fabrication. They will say things in a convincing way. They know how to lie convincingly, because that's how they are able to assimilate into society when they don't actually have these feelings for other people. And if you want to hear any of the other episodes about serial killers, there are over 2,000 episodes of Black Box Online Radio now, and you can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Dennis Nilsen. Now, this is a story, though, that does expand in some different directions, because Dennis Nilsen not only kept one body and watched TV with him and listened to music with him, he did this multiple times, and one time he even kept a body for over 8 months, and then would do things to just try and preserve the corpse, just so the smell wouldn't spread around. Dennis Nilsen worked as a civil servant, by the way, and he would also just use this as a complete double life. Now, this portion here about how he is only doing these things when he is drinking excessively, that is another thing that is reported by Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal. Jeffrey Dahmer stated by his own admission that the only reason that he got caught was because he was drinking too much and he lost awareness of what he was doing and he stopped being careful. And what it seems like is happening with Dennis Nilsen is that he is somebody who gets inebriated, he listens to music, and he would go into this type of almost drunken stupor-like state where his destructive tendencies would come out. Have you ever heard the expression, the truth comes out when you're drunk? And that's exactly what I think was happening with Dennis Nilsen. Now, there is another documentary that was put out on the True Crime Central channel that is available here on YouTube for free, and they did it in somewhat of a bizarre way, because they're trying to ask the question, should you blame Dennis Nilsen for the crimes, or should you blame his mother? And I was just like, when I'm listening to that, I was like, absolutely, you blame Dennis Nilsen for the crimes, no matter what his mother did to him, unless she was a direct and active participant in the murders. She didn't force him to commit the murders, no matter what experience he would have had in his childhood. That doesn't mean that he should have gone on to become a serial killer. And you just heard this thing here about murdering 15 people, luring them from gay bars back to his home, dismembering their bodies, keeping them in different places, as well as just trying to have conversations with the corpses. And this is something, though, that I think is so far beyond just whatever his mother did to him. This just goes to show that he's a psychopathic serial killer who did these things to fuel his own excitement because of an early obsession with morbidity. Maybe there was some genuine emotional distress that he experienced when his grandfather died, but that doesn't mean that he should have killed anyone. Blame the killer and absolutely nothing else. But what they were trying to do is they're trying to understand, was he somebody who was born to kill, or was he somebody who developed these destructive tendencies because of society and the social surroundings? And my honest answer is, I think that it is a combination of both, and no one wants to hear that. Do you blame his mother, or do you blame society, or do you blame him? Yes, you blame him, but the reasons why I say that is, this is even mentioned in the Program to Kill documentary when they talk about how he most likely had the genetic components that would drive someone to go on to become a serial killer. And they believe that these genetic components were exacerbated by the loss of his grandfather, as well as being a homosexual and not being able to outwardly express himself and have open relationships when he was in public, and just always having to hide, so to speak. But once you hear these stories about Dennis Nilsen, about how, he just only wants to talk in an outward way and doesn't want to listen to other people, and even talking about how he would have these big obsessions with pieces of machinery like the record player and so on, because with something like a record player, he can control that. He just can be in complete control. It's like it's an object. So he wants to use the dead people that he murdered as objects to fuel his own excitement. And that's how psychopathic people operate. Even psychopaths that are not serial killers, that's how they operate. They do this in a way in which they're trying to use other people purely to fuel their own excitement for their own benefit, and that is the long and short of it. And some other details about the activities of Dennis Nilsen, I shouldn't say activities, the crimes and atrocities committed by Dennis Nilsen, are that the police found the stove in Nilsen's apartment that was caked with grease from human fat because Nilsen had boiled body parts to make them easier to cut apart. And this is another one. Nilsen simmered heads in a cooking pot overnight. And then there was a tea chest that provided unceremonious storage for Nilsen's last victim's remains. 2 of Nilsen's victims were dissected in the bath, and a portion of one body was found stowed under the tub. The killer used a common knife to dismember the bodies of the victims. Air fresheners were not enough to hide the smell of the decaying limbs and organs, and they were placed into trash bags. So this also goes to show something that is very, very common and very, very frequently discussed about serial killers, and that is that when someone is trying to dismember the remains of the victims. There are usually two major reasons for this. Number one is transportation. And number two is to destroy evidence. They're trying to move the victim's body to some other location, and also they're trying to just destroy anything that could trace it back to the killer, because Dennis Nilsen even states in these Time Life articles that the quotations from him is that the reason why he did this is just he felt like he had to keep doing it. It was the only thing that brought him fulfillment. It was the only thing that brought him some type of happiness. And I don't think that that was true happiness. I think this is an immoral happiness that I've already described. It's trying to fuel his own excitement. But this concept of transportation and destroying of evidence, that's ultimately what led Dennis Nilsen to be captured. Because what happened was someone interrupted his activities, or let's say his crimes and atrocities, and he was trying to destroy the evidence of one of the victims by flushing the remains of the body parts down the toilet, and ultimately it clogged the toilet, which led to a series of events which allowed the authorities to come over to his home, and they just saw right through any type of facade that he was trying to put on. And ultimately, Dennis Nilsen was captured and apprehended. And this was pretty much an open and shut conviction. But I would like to look at a different page here in the Time Life articles that states, after Nilsen moved to the attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, it became dramatically more reckless for him to keep killing. Not only was he without a convenient place for burning his victims, but since his new floors would not accommodate bodies, he no longer even had suitable storage. Nevertheless, he was apparently beyond the point where he could live very long without murdering, as I said, trying to fuel his own excitement. Within 6 months he was at it again, strangling a man named John Howlett at a London ne'er-to-do-well whom he had befriended at a bar. Howlett's murder was marked by a ferocious struggle in which the victim was amazed by his assailant. By appearing to come back to life over and over again, Nilsen finally drowned the luckless Howlett in a bathtub. Howlett was followed within a few weeks by Graham Allen, who was garroted while eating an omelette. Nilsen had prepared for him. The new bodies would be disposed of in a way that was even more degrading than the previous methods. After storing the corpses for several days in either a wardrobe or the bathtub, Nilsen cut them into small chunks and flushed them down the toilet. To facilitate this messy and time-consuming process, Nilsen boiled certain sections of the bodies on top of the stove using a big soup pot that he had acquired after his first murder. The heads were boiled for hours on end, and trying to render them down to the mere bone. Skulls and sections of the bodies provided too formidable to be hacked into fragments or discarded with the trash. These Nilsen hid here about the flat. Among the places was a wooden tea chest that was draped with a red curtain. Apparently he also discarded a few bags of human remains along this route with his dog Bleep. And this is something, though, that I think is just so typical among serial killers, is how they create these types of facades, and they actually do live out these portions of their lives, where he's, a civil servant, he is someone who is just an independent person, he has a dog named Bleep, and that just comes across as gentle and adorable, and it's really this twofold way where you're never going to know the truth about how much he actually enjoys these aspects of ordinary life, or if this is something that he is doing purely to try and manipulate people to facilitate the murderous side. And one thing that I've never liked about serial killers is the concept of, oh, this person has, the light side and the dark side. This is the facade and the true self. No, I don't think that's how serial killers operate. I think they have different aspects of their lives that they are living out, and in their mind, their actions are justified. They know that they are illegal, but they feel like they have some type of deserving entitlement to commit these actions because they experienced abuse, rejection, or even some type of major loss in their life. Therefore, they are getting revenge on society, or even just they're fueling excitement in a way that is justified to them because other people get to fuel their excitement in different ways. Well, this is just how I do it, and even if it's more destructive, I still get to do it because I like the way it feels. And it's sort of in their own twisted sense of reasoning, it's like a to each his own experience. And let's keep going here. In June of 1982, after having been stuck with the same job for nearly 8 years, Dennis Nilsen won a promotion, was transferred to the Kentish Town Job Centre. He was elated at this new responsibility with fresh vigor, but his private life had deteriorated beyond the point where he could harbor any serious illusion about putting things permanently on an even keel. Already dedicated to being a civil servant, was in an awkward predicament of having to regularly replenish the supply of deodorant sticks hidden about his apartment, and he knew the stench of his partially discarded trophies might someday bring about his downfall. Besides, one last murder awaited him. Stephen Sinclair was the 15th man for whom a friendly invitation to Des Nilsen's apartment was summoned to death. A drug addict, Sinclair had passed out from a dose of narcotics, providing Nilsen with the opportunity to slip a cord around his neck, without much effort, cut off the supply of oxygen, and afterward the killer bathed Sinclair's body and used it for forlorn socializing, excuse me, and that's just another example of how he is doing these things to the bodies, but he really wants them to stay with him. Jeffrey Dahmer said this clear as day that he did that so the victims wouldn't leave him. The only reason that Jeffrey Dahmer killed the victims was because he wanted them to stay with him. He also consumed them because he wanted them to be part of him. And it seems like there's just very, very similar psychological patterns that are going along with Dennis Nilsen, where he had a genetic predisposition to kill. He had a neurological issue where he is acting on his urges to do this, and it is bringing about a type of stimulation. And also it seems like he had a lot of abuse and neglect, particularly neglect. And this is what the True Crime Central documentary was trying to get things down to when they're asking that question, should they blame his mother or not? Did she not recognize that there were warning signs, or did she not recognize that there was some type of need for extra attention with Dennis Nilsen? And the answer to those questions is absolutely yes. But that doesn't mean that he should have continued with this. It doesn't mean that it's her fault. She didn't put the knife in his hand. She didn't tell him to dismember the bodies, and she didn't tell him to flush human remains down the toilet, and nor did she even guide him in that point. Lots of people have a lack of bonding with their parents. Lots of people have bad experiences when they're growing up, such as the passing of their grandfather, and they don't go on to become serial killers. This is why you have to blame the killer and put the responsibility on that of the killer, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are committing these very heinous atrocities, and they have the conscious choice not to. They have the ability to say, okay, well, I'm not going to do this, I'm just going to do something else, and they do have these bizarre types of urges. I mean, isn't it so obvious that they have urges to do this? It creates an intense form of stimulation and it fuels their excitement, so that's why they're doing this. Whereas people who function in society in a different way are just going to get some type of stimulation from watching sports, or from going for a walk in the park, or going jogging, or maybe even having consensual sex among adults. Whereas serial killers are going to do this in a very destructive way. Very clearly, this is somebody who is doing this because he liked the way it felt. I mean, that's just my take on the subject, and if you want to challenge me, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. So this whole point, though, here about the socializing is just that's another example of how he's actually using human bodies as a way to almost have types of friends, the same way that he is obsessed with, the record player, that when he's in social situations, he is just acting in a way that is not very sociable. He's just kind of monologuing to himself. Well, that's how he can behave around these people whom he has just murdered, as terrible as that sounds, but that does appear to be what was happening. So, Dennis Nilsen stashed his last flatmate in the wardrobe for a week. He'd begun the weary business of disposing the corpse when the plumbers started poking about the apartment, and Nilsen realized with dread and relief that his life of crime was finally ending. And the reason why it says flatmate is that's just the title of the set of articles in this Time Life book about how it's called Flatmates. That's a section on Dennis Nilsen. That's why they're referring to them as that. But, of course, these are people that he is meeting, bringing into his home. And one other point that is mentioned in the very beginning of the Time Life article is that he was offering people who are sort of down on their luck or in poor circumstances, he's offering them food and luring them back. Whereas somebody like Herb Baumeister, the I-70 Strangler whom I mentioned, he was attracting people in a different way. He would meet men at gay bars, and he would show them photos of his house and say, oh yeah, I live in a house that's really nice. It's $1 million mansion. It has 18 acres, 11,000 square feet. And he would come over and give them a tour, and then he would strangle them. And strangulation is very key, because this is when someone can actually feel the act of killing someone. It's one of the most personal and up-close forms of murder, as opposed to gunshots, or even opposed to stabbing someone, because this one, you really have to hold the person down and to feel every ounce of power slipping away from the other individual. And I don't think it's an accident that Herb Baumeister and Dennis Nilsen did this. They wanted to have power over their victims. They wanted to have control over their victims. And in the creation of the morbid situation, they felt that they had some type of power because they felt powerless as children. And one more time, the sources that I've been citing for this episode of Black Box Online Radio here are are from the Time Life Collective, which is a set of articles called Flatmates about Dennis Nilsen, the True Crime Central documentary, and an episode of Born to Kill, which featured Dr. Louis Schlesinger, someone whom I've talked about a lot on the channel in the past, as well as Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, people who are no strangers to the world of true crime and true crime television. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Black Box Ned, and if you want to share something about serial killers, you can put your ideas on the comment section down below. If you have any ideas for future episodes of Black Box Online Radio, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and even if you just want to keep the discussion going, you can get this on Facebook under the Black Box Online Radio Facebook page and BlackBoxNet88 on Instagram, and I will see you over there. Until next time.